Good morning and welcome everybody to our 10th edition of Africa Talks. My colleague Eka and I, we welcome you for this edition about the situation of global vaccination. And we hope that you had a good start in the new year. Africa Talks is designed as a digital platform for exchange of African and European topics, exchange of knowledge and ideas between journalists and experts from civil society from both continents. We want to learn, engage, and discuss about what are the impacts and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Marco Roma. I'm the member of the board of the International Journalist Programs, IJP. And I would like to introduce Ika, and I have an advice or a request for our technical colleague. We have an echo on our phones, so if you could erase that echo, that would be fine. But now, Ika.
Thank you. I'm Ika Neumann, and I'm the coordinator for the South African program of the IJP programs, the International Journalism Programs, and I'm very excited to talk about this topic today. And I have to correct you, Marco, we are in the 9th edition today. So the 10th is still going to come. Today is the 9th. But we are very
Our
happy
topic for today, Africa Talks, are COVID-19 vaccinations deepening rifts between the northern and southern hemispheres. Africa's hurdles on the road to COVID-19 vaccination are huge. While vaccination has already begun in Western Europe, the southern continent has to wait. Poor countries can't afford a vaccine, and even without electricity and refrigeration, distribution becomes also a real problem. The African Agency for Disease Control estimates that a total 1.5 billion doses would be needed to vaccinate 60% of the population. Cost between 7 and 10 billion US dollars. Many African countries lack this money. One way out, the COVAX initiative. We want to talk about that. The EU Commission and the World Health Organization, WHO, and France launched it in April. The initiative aims to ensure that all countries have equal access to corona vaccines. Poorer countries are also to receive financial support. 46 African countries can hope for this, according to the WHO. How can adequate vaccination in African countries be achieved? What are the challenges for the COVAX initiative, and how can foundations or other organizations from private or public sector support? This we want to discuss with our distinguished guest of today. And our first speaker is Dr. Andreas Wulf. He was born in 1965 in Hanover, Germany. He studied medicine at the Free University Berlin. 1995, he co-founded the Berlin Office for Medical Refugee Aid, today the Medibureau Berlin Network for the Right to Healthcare for All Migrants. 1996, he volunteered in the Center for Victims of Torture in Berlin. In 1998, he finished his formal medical training and started working with Medico International as a project coordinator for health and global health advocate. In 2019, he became Berlin representative of Medico International. He finished an MD on the history of industrial hygiene and occupational medicine during the Weimar Republic in 2001. And since 2007, he serves on the board of the German Association of Democratic Doctors from 2015 till 2019 on its executive board. Andreas Wulf, welcome on our show and great to have you here.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Vollmer. Good morning, Mr. Neumann. I'm happy to be invited. I'm very honored to be invited, actually, and would like to give a very short introduction and then hand over to...
Before you start, we just want to introduce our second speaker and our graphic recorder, and then we start the show, okay? Ika.
Yeah.
So I would like to introduce to you Professor Leslie London. He is the head of the Division of Public Health Medicine of the School of Public Health and Family Medicine. I hope I got this correctly, which is part of the Cape Town University. Is that right? I hope so. That's right. Yes, Mr. Leslie London is a public health specialist with an interest in human rights, public health ethics, farm workers' health, prevention of alcohol-related harms and health hazards of pesticides. He's the head of the Division of Public Health Medicine, leads the Health and Human Rights Program, and he's an active researcher with a very rich track record of publications. And in the Center of Occupational and Environment Health Research, he provides technical support to the principal XDR-TB panel and to the public health functions of the Health Impact Assessment Directorate as the Health Department. So thank you very much for being with us today with your very rich experience contributing to our topic today.
And before we start, we would just like to introduce our graphic recorder, Wiebke. She is taking graphical notes, which we will see at the end of our talk. Do we have Wiebke here? Hello and good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I look forward to providing a little bit of visual support.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And now we want to start. We want to invite all of our users and participants to contribute to our discussion. Leave a message, leave a comment under our Facebook or YouTube stream if you like, and we would bring your thought into the discussion. But now, Andreas, the floor is yours. Welcome to Africa Talks 9th edition.
Yeah, thank you very much again, and welcome. And I'm happy to share my points in this morning for all of you. The Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, warned on last Monday, 18th January 2021, when opening the 148th session of the Executive Board of the World Health Organization, quote, that the world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure, unquote. Why? Because the lofty promises of last spring that COVID-19 vaccines and other tools to overcome the pandemic must be global public goods for all have failed utterly. Enormous public money was invested in the research and development of diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines against COVID-19 over the last year, but public return on these public investments remains scarce. The rules of the game that give the final inventors of such products, most often private pharmaceutical companies, a monopoly on them through the patent system at the World Trade Organization seem to be carved in stone. They are favoriting not only the owners of patents, data, and trademarks, but also the well-off countries that can pre-book and prepay those expensive products and keep the poor out of the race for the vaccines. To quote Dr. Tedros again, more than 39 million doses of vaccines have now been administered in at least 49 higher income countries. Just 25 doses have been given in one lowest income country. Not 25 million, not 25,000, just 25, unquote. How can such inequity be overcome? Multiple mechanisms were proposed to promote and advance an equitable sharing and access to these essential goods to overcome the pandemic. Always reminding us of the crucial lesson: the pandemic will not be over until it's over for all. The latest initiative from October 2020 to temporarily waiving the intellectual property rules at the WTO so that medicines and vaccines can be copied by other producers quicker and cheaper. This was initiated by South Africa and India, two countries with a substantial COVID-19 epidemic, has been stalled again just 2 days ago at the informal TRIPS Council meeting. Another proposal for pooling voluntary licensing and know-how to speed up technology transfer that is needed to overcome the scarcity of COVID-19 tools, the so-called COVID-19 Access Technology Pool, or CTAP, was proposed already last May by a group of more than 40 countries under the roof of the WHO. This concept, shaped after the successful medicines patent pool for AIDS treatment globally, has never sought support from relevant countries with research capacities and even active hostility from the pharmaceutical industry. And finally, the much propagated Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator with a COVAX initiative that was mentioned already by Mr. Vollmer, handled by the Global Health Public-Private Partnerships, Gavi and CEPI. From concept, this should have been a common effort for countries rich and poor to assure an equitable share of vaccines as they become available, while pooling strategic funding and negotiating power for lower prices vis-à-vis the pharmaceutical companies. De facto, the rich countries buy themselves off with a solidarity funding for the poorest 92 countries that will have to wait until the companies have served most of their over 50 bilateral deals that they have closed with the richer and some middle-income countries. The big companies do not even bother to register their vaccines with the WHO, which would speed up substantially the registration process in poorer countries with limited administrative resources. And to add insult to injury, the much-needed health system component of these accelerator initiatives that were introduced only as an afterthought into this impressive architecture has received until now only minimal funding. This will prove particularly crucial. Without strong health systems, the perspective of rapidly vaccinating billions of people worldwide become an ever-distant dream, not to speak of the eroding public trust in these systems that is already hampering the rollout of vaccination, even in the high-income countries. The role of civil society cannot be underestimated in these struggles. Activists in South Africa, in Kenya, in India, or in Brazil have been most vocal to hold their governments to account for a pandemic response that is securing the health and the social rights of the citizens. And globally, a new movement has formed on the experience of struggles for access to AIDS medicines 20 years ago that fought against the same patent laws that are under discussion now again. The big companies and the rich states claim against evidence that patents have nothing to do with access to COVID-19 vaccines and other tools. They don't want to rock the boat of global economic governance of today. But this is the only chance we have to rock the boat, to exempt essential health knowledge and tools from private ownership to make them accessible to all. As John Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, said, when questions about who owns these vaccines in 1955, well, the people, I would say, there is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. And Dr. Andreas Wulf, I would like to give the floor to Professor Leslie London. Leslie, would you want to give us your input?
Thank you, Ika, and thank you for the opportunity to share this. As Andreas has pointed out, there can be no doubt that COVID-19 has exposed the fault lines of what is an egregious inequality, both within and between countries, and it's particularly evident in this huge inequality in access to vaccines for COVID, so eloquently made clear by the Director General of the WHO as this catastrophic moral failure, which is the result of protecting the profits of vaccine manufacturers at the expense of the rights of health workers and vulnerable populations in poorer countries. This is a situation that has arisen out of the failure of the system constructed supposedly to achieve equitable access for vaccines. I speak here not just as a public health professor from South Africa, but also a member of the People's Health Movement, a global social movement promoting the right to health, and a participant in the civil society's C19 People's Coalition in South Africa, believing in social justice that can only be achieved if there is global social justice, not one system for Europe and another for poor people and poor countries. So firstly, COVAX. COVAX has too many flaws. Firstly, it solidifies the market. The prices under which vaccines are sold is not transparent. What you get as a vaccine through COVAX is not transparent. And what you get will be long after everyone else buys something. And what you get might not work for your health system. Okay, the reference was made in the introduction that some vaccines require cold chains that developing countries do not have. COVAX is currently only providing 15% of the world's vaccines, yet is meant to reach all low-income countries unable to pay. We have 56 bilateral deals at last count, and COVAX is still in the doldrums. High-income countries have purchased more than 4 times the amount that COVAX has been promised to provide countries that cannot afford to purchase. So vaccine nationalism is no longer spoken of with criticism. It's now accepted as the norm. Even South Africa is suddenly purchasing huge amounts of vaccines for its people, when in December all it could talk about was COVAX. But in South Africa, we still don't know how much and what is coming via COVAX, and South Africa has then gone and cut bilateral deals. And in doing that, they are simply doing what the North has been doing for a long time. And even within South Africa, we see one of the provinces in the Western Cape lining up to go independently to the manufacturers outside of national procurement. This is vaccine nationalism at a provincial level, and it is completely mad. The audience knows well that in Germany, there's huge pressure on Chancellor Merkel to bypass the EU so as to procure enough vaccine for its entire population. This situation reflects the broader political problem, an environment in which cooperative multilateralism has given way to national and even subnational interest. Member states of the WHO should work with the WHO to strengthen it and provide it with sufficient funding to do its job. The WHO is meant to be the steward of global health, but it has been systematically weakened by decades of underfunding and political interference by both powerful states and non-state actors. Will Biden restore the US's commitment to the WHO? That will be as important as solving the vaccine challenges facing Africa as would be tinkering with the COVAX. Essentially, what we have now is an uncoordinated and opportunistic set of arrangements with no guarantee of local benefit. For example, the South African pharmaceutical company Aspen will be filling and finishing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but there's no clarity if any of those vaccines will be used for South Africans, or indeed for any Africans on the continent. The terms and conditions of that agreement are entirely untransparent and simply left to 2 companies to negotiate. As the Aspen press release read, we are particularly pleased to be given the opportunity of providing assistance for patients in need across the world from our South African base. So there you have it. Nothing for South Africa, nothing for Africa, but Johnson & Johnson have a production site in South Africa with only the most minimal of technology transfer and no capacity to produce the vaccine in South Africa for Africa in the long term. That cannot be right. DG Tedros has shown up 2 big flaws in the system. Firstly, the lack of transparency about what is being negotiated in bilateral contracts, at what price, what volumes, what delivery rate, since it is clear that preference is being given to voting adults in northern countries whose need is less than the health workers, elderly, and persons with comorbidities in low-income countries. Secondly, why haven't the vaccine producers provided the WHO with full data for regulatory review in real time to accelerate approvals? But the problem is that if countries that have overproduced give their excess that they procured back to COVAX, at what price will they do so? And when? Under what conditions? So any low middle income country will be at the mercy of northern countries' charity. That is not a sustainable system. Meanwhile, in Africa, the sorry state of health systems remains a huge block. Zimbabwe's health system, as we know, is struggling to manage under COVID. Yet the more vaccines South Africa procures, the less will be available to countries who depend on COVAX, who can't afford to go knocking on the doors of the Serum Institute of India. We know that the African Union CDC has begun negotiating vaccine procurement for multi-country access on the continent, yet the political structures of our countries, such as the SADC, the South African Development Community, has not been proactive. But for sustainable solutions, we really need local production in Africa. And why do I say that? Firstly, the current system does not guarantee enough vaccine via COVAX. That is clear. nor does it guarantee the vaccine in time. Secondly, the vaccine will need to be provided annually, not as a once-off. Thirdly, the virus is mutating. We are still not sure that the vaccines will be as effective for the new N501Y variant, and it's almost certain we will be asking the same question in future when a new variant appears. We can't wait for a northern producer to discover a new form of vaccine for a southern problem. We know that local production is already advanced in Asia, it's advancing in Latin America, but not in Africa. Of course, to ensure equitable access to vaccines, Africa must play its part through regional cooperation in logistic, legal, and institutional capacity. We already have regulatory authorities in the region cooperating around questions of medicine access, and we can build on that to ensure the safety and cross-border issues, given the movement of people between and amongst countries in the region. What this points to is that the COVAX mechanism might have been thought of as a good compromise, but it's not working. You only have to look at South Africa to realize we would not have been able to rely on COVAX for our high-risk population, which is probably between 40 to 50% of our population, and far more than the 20% that was suggested as a ceiling under COVAX. And we still don't know what COVAX will deliver to South Africa. And that's the point. The better mechanism and more sustainable would have been to unlock the patent protections on vaccines and other health technologies, I should say, which would bring down prices and enable conditions where local production in low middle income countries might be possible. This is what the TRIPS waiver proposed by South Africa, India, and other low middle income countries, but opposed by the US, European Union, and others, intends to do. The waiver is the one proposal that does change the rules because it challenges the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem that the system has centralized power in the hands of vaccine producers and their states. The fact that Director General Tedros has had to plead with vaccine producers to, and I quote, allow states to share doses and appeal countries to work together in solidarity emphasizes that the bigger issue of corporate power is still being sidestepped. What we now have is a country-by-country stampede and a lack of benefit sharing. There are South Africans, Egyptians, Ugandans participating in trials as we speak, but there's no benefit sharing agreement that has been reached, none for Africa as a whole. Yet UNESCO, international ethics declarations, and international conventions, such as the Nagoya Protocol on the Convention of Biological Diversity, signed by Germany and other European countries, talk about the benefit sharing from genetic research. The Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights recognizes the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress, and the recent General Comment 25 on this right sets out the obligations of states as including the ensuring that everyone has equal access to the applications of science, particularly where they are instrumental to the enjoyment of other rights, that states should guarantee the social dimensions of intellectual property, and that state parties have a duty to prevent unreasonably high costs for access to essential medicines from undermining the rights of the population. Importantly, state parties also have an extraterritorial obligation to regulate and monitor the conduct of multinational companies over which they can exercise control. The message cannot be clearer. And remember that we need strong health systems in Africa, both to deliver the vaccine, but also to address the many other health problems facing the African population. So I'd like to reiterate what Andreas said. It's time the world woke up. This inequality will kill people on a global scale, as it did with HIV, until civil society forced Big Pharma to cede power. That is the scenario we're looking at again. Hopefully we have learned something from the past before too many of our people die. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leslie London, for that, for your thoughts here. And to get into the discussion, our Q&A session now, I think, and what I heard is that we are facing two major issues here. First, we have this global inequality. And secondly, we need to think about the mechanism of patent protections, which make a distribution, an equal distribution, much more difficult. My first question would be on to both of you, like, yes, we have this inequality and this global injustice, I even would say, but how can we overcome that issue first? And secondly, what could be done? What are concepts of civil society, of organizations like Medico, to discuss and this issue of patent protection? Because here I think is a way out of our problem. But like how? You say, Professor Leslie Lunnan, public needs to force, the corporations, the pharmaceutical companies, or whatever. But how could that be done? Maybe Andreas, you start, and then Leslie, you follow.
Good. Yeah, thanks. I think it's clear, and this is what you say, that what both of us have pointed out, that the global health challenges cannot be overcome by a charity approach, but needs this solidarity mechanism that gives also a longer perspective on not just distributing vaccines that are now available, and there is a race for these vaccines because there is a scarcity of them as we speak, but more important is to look into these structures that make this competition around this vaccine nationalism possible. And this only works out when you look into concepts of public return on public investment. This is very clear. This is the concept of the Nagoya protocol, whereas benefit sharing and risk sharing belongs together. That has, meaning that if you are able to solve problems, then you're not solving them for you alone. And this also means that for example, public funding for research and development of vaccines and medicines need to be accompanied by mechanisms, and also to write into the contracts that give money to these public money to this research, that the knowledge that comes out of this is shared, and not only shared but also transferred. You need the technology transfer to make it possible, and this is something that I think is a way forward to think access to medicines, access to vaccines. Can be improved, but if there is a strong mechanism for this kind of public sharing. Thanks. Okay, and what civil society? I think the civil society has been always a big watchdog on this process. I think this is the major point. We say we want to hold the countries to account exactly to implement such kind of policies. That's the basic work, we think.
Thank you, Leslie.
So my response is the following. We are really talking about a public good. I don't really have a problem, if an entrepreneur invents a new office printer or a new platform for digital communication, and that's protected by 20 years of patent. But we're talking about a public good. We're talking about people's lives, and we have to do something different. So we saw with HIV that it was actually civil society that pressed, and the Doha Declaration emerged from that, where civil society partnered with governments, and it produced a sort of moment where the intellectual property regime was changed somewhat, and as a result, after that, drug prices came down. It was mainly driven through competition, and millions of people's lives were saved. But the problem with TRIPS at the moment, it's not able to respond to the current epidemic. The TRIPS flexibilities are not very flexible. They're actually quite difficult to implement. You've seen the record of TRIPS. It's quite hard for a southern country to implement. You have to implement it technology by technology. And this is a solution which provides an easy opportunity. Countries don't have to implement it if they don't want to implement it. So it's not clear to me why it's actually a threat to innovation. It's a crisis, and we try to address it through a means which will ensure that people get access to the kinds of things that all the rights conventions that Germany and European countries and other countries that science say we should do. The right to health, the right to access to health technologies. I think the bottom line is voluntarism does not work. If we rely on companies doing something out of the good of their hearts. We've seen the CTAP pool is basically moribund. COVAX is struggling. We actually need a system which takes away the incentives to withhold property, intellectual property patents, so that you can get the most profit. There's ways of structuring this so that a fair profit can be gotten, but not at the expense of human lives. And I think that's the role of civil society, to keep pressure so that the system changes, that it doesn't continually replicate this unfair extraction of profit at the expense of human well-being and human life.
Eka, allow me one additional question, especially for Professor London. I fully understand your point. Thank you for that, and I agree with you. But I wonder whether you can say, okay, this kind of vaccine and of other pharmaceutical product is a so-called public good, because when there is no incentive for companies or corporations to do research and to do development on these things, this is always the argument from the business side. Progress will not happen, and I think the way that we try to incentivize research and development by private corporations, by pharmaceutical companies, is okay as long or unless the WHO or other global institutions assure or make sure that these things are distributed in a better and a more accurate way, so that they create a fund or whatever, so that you can pay for it as a public good. But I think the other way around wouldn't work, because then the efforts to do some research on these things, when there is no monetarization behind, it will be difficult. And I wonder whether you think that could be overcome in a more global way, and not on a way that private sector is investing here.
So there are sort of global intergovernmental and multi-stakeholder forums that exist that have tried to address this, but they've addressed it without changing the basic rules. Basic rules here are essentially a lack of transparency. So what is a fair profit that a company can make? You can't say what's fair unless you know what it really costs. And we know that huge amounts of public money have gone into the funding of many of the vaccines. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the German company, the Pfizer Intech company, got a lot of money from the German government to develop its vaccine. So there's a lot of public investment in research, which is ignored when it comes to the discussions around intellectual property. And I think the way the system should be structured should be the other way around. That, with full transparency, it's quite possible for a company to make a fair profit. But at the moment, the system is set up so that companies are able to, evergreen medicines, where there's no actual intellectual property contribution, and charge a lot of money. And at the moment, the vaccines are being sold, and we don't know what they're being sold for, and we don't know whether drug company, vaccine producers are selling to boost their profits first, and the developing countries just have to wait in line while their populations die. That system can't work. So we need another system, and I agree with you. It needs to be a system that is fair, but fair all round, and that's what the Covenant on Social and Economic Rights says. It says there needs to be a balance between intellectual property protection and the public good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question from a slightly different angle. Because I've been wondering in the past, when there were inventions of new pharmaceutical treatments, there's been criticism that these new pharmaceutical products have been mainly tested on young European or Western men. And that my question would be, has there been already a track record, or are you aware of track record of enough testing on African people or people of African descent?
Well, I could respond to that. So, as I understand, there are 3 countries that are participating in trials in Africa. So that's in Egypt, South Africa, Uganda. To the extent that that represents a sort of diversity of a population, yes. I'm not sure that the trials were really structured to look at the efficacy in different contexts. Not all of them were, some of them were. But that certainly is some data, and it shouldn't be an impediment to rolling out the trials under the emergency situation. I mean, the fact that there's a diaspora of African people across the world might present problems in developed countries where subpopulations might have less efficacy, but that's part of the trial designs, which as I understand, have attempted to do that as best they can. But post vaccine rollout monitoring will pick up if there are any problems or if there's any less efficacy or greater efficacy. But sure, it's a valid concern.
Okay. Andreas, would you want to add something?
Yeah. I think this debate about where and what and who to do trials with is a very loaded issue. I remember from the very first moment when COVID-19 trials started, there was also on the other hand, a big concern that poor people, African people, would be used as guinea pigs in these trials to invent medicines and vaccines that are not accessible to them afterwards. I think this is something that is a history that exists in the post-colonial times, of course. At the moment, and so it is also very important that you have the trust of the scientific community to develop their concepts and also their trials according to scientific rigor, rather than also the feeling it is easier or cheaper to do trials in countries that have, for example, a less rigorous control system in it. And I think this also has to be taken into account. While for the situation of vaccine research, what I understand, and I'm not a vaccine researcher, is that, of course, the major trials had to be there where the epidemic is most pronounced, because only then you can see in a short period of time if your vaccine is working or not. So you have to test the vaccines in countries like Brazil, like the US, like Europe, and rather not in South Africa or Uganda, but not in 40 other African countries where you have a rather limited exposure of the pandemic. That's also what I understood from it.
Another question, which is, Iko, do you want to add?
You can go first.
Okay. Another discussion, which is, or another point, which is highly being discussed at the moment here on the European continent, especially also in Germany, is that there are already, which is normal when you see pandemics. It is normal that the virus COVID-19 produces mutations. Is that the right word? I think that there are 2 mutations of this original COVID-19 virus, one coming from, or one being seen for the first time in the UK, and the second in South Africa. And I wonder whether you both, working in the medical sector, have already any experience with this mutation of that virus, and if you can tell us something about the situation, Professor London, in South Africa, and maybe Andreas, how you're working with these mutations and what your strategies are to fight these mutations.
So thanks. So as I understand, the mutations in South Africa and the UK are similar and probably related to the fact there's a lot of travel between South Africa and the UK, and the mutation in Brazil is a different one. The current wisdom is that the mutation in South Africa is a more infectious variant, and that possibly explains why our second wave has been more intense. But it's not more virulent. In other words, it doesn't have higher mortality rates as far as we know, and we understand that the vaccine developed prior to the variants appearing is still effective. That's one of the questions we're going to have to monitor as we roll out our vaccine program. But it's the point I was making that even if the current vaccines are effective on this mutation or variant, there will be future variants. We can be sure about that, and we have to have the technology to address that, which is why a system which relies on a northern company to develop the vaccine will take forever to address a local problem if we don't have the capacity locally to address it. It's an additional argument for why it's so important to develop capacity in developing countries to produce the vaccine.
Yeah, what I can add is not very much, because our partners, that the work that Medico is supporting is focusing basically on primary healthcare level work rather than the scientific medical work needed to deal with the mutation viruses. So with regard to the non-pharmaceutical interventions that are most important to keep the epidemic at bay, there is no much difference in dealing with the different variations of the virus, as I understood it. What I find is more important is that, and this is what I can add from the experience of our partners, is particular that working with communities and keeping them involved also in the development of dynamics and pandemics is extremely important, because you only can deal and successfully overcome a pandemic, and we have seen this several times in also in Ebola, when the people and the public is really trusting the information that comes out from science, from the government, from the public health institutions. And this is a crucial point that is often missed, and sometimes that as more authoritarian policy is, and seeing the public only as the recipient of things they have to do, this is not going to bring us much further. And I think we have to keep in mind that we probably, with these mutations and without these mutations, COVID-19 will not go away very quickly. And we really have to strive for such a long-term perspective, dealing and supporting our people and local communities.
Following up on the local communities, I have got a question in context with that. Now the focus is very much on one strategy, which is vaccinating the population, as many people as possible. And I've got a question around, would it also be like a strategy to focus a little more on general public health and also other protective mechanisms like a healthy environment, to also put more strength also on that aspect? What do you think?
So, Ika, I couldn't agree with you more. So the vaccine is important. We know the vaccine is important. But it's not the only solution, because it's not going to be 100% effective. And there might be variants coming out. And we still need to pursue other measures to prevent COVID. And the measures are difficult in developing countries. So we have very dense settlements in South Africa where people are not able to effectively socially distance, where hand washing is not that easy, where access to sanitizers is not that simple. So all those measures are really important. And on top of that, we have to deliver healthcare, both preventive and curative, for all kinds of things. We have to maintain a malaria prevention program. We have to ensure that kids are not dehydrating from diarrhea in summer, which is a big cause of child mortality in South Africa. So when the COVID epidemic hit, we had a lot of de-escalation of basic primary care. We know that immunization rates have fallen, that diagnostic testing for TB declined, and those things need to be restored. And if the vaccination program takes hold and reduces the impact of COVID, we will have a big catch-up in general. But I agree with you totally. This is not a magic bullet, and it's part of an entire health system strengthening initiative that we need to pursue.
Yeah, I think also maybe just to add, I think the vaccination approach is always looking into people who have not yet ill with the COVID-19, but as important as it is to vaccinate, we also not should lose sight of trying to improve the treatment options that we have for COVID-19, because this is what basically would also make it much easier to deal emotionally, and I think also, but particularly also from the side of the health workers who have a big workload on patients with treatment.
Can you give us some of your experiences you make during your daily work, Andrea, as working for Medico? Like, what is the situation in African countries, and also maybe, Andreas, as you are now here streamed from Germany, compared to Germany, what kind of differences do you see here in the reactions of the people on both sides?
I would leave South Africa out, so for Leslie to answer. I think this is more fair. Now, what I would say is, and what the experience of our partners in East Africa or also North Africa is, of course, and the most important, I would say, what I would like to stress is that you have to understand that this is what Leslie already said, that COVID-19 is adding up on strained health systems and a lot of health problems that people might have. And then COVID-19 is not the only one, and in many countries of Africa, I would say not the most important one, immediate concern for the people there. Luckily, we see, and there is a big debate about why infection rates and why death rates in many African countries are not as high as they are in other parts of the world, and particularly also not in Europe. And so the focus, and this has a lot of questions if it is not recorded well and enough, and it's not enough tested enough, but it probably also is because this particular virus is not as in many places, like outside South Africa, because this is the big other situation, and also some East African countries, is not so much affecting people, because they are young enough so that they have very low, very light illnesses. And so in that way, I would say the need of people to not to balance, but to integrate the response to COVID-19 into already existing health challenges is the most different thing between the experience of COVID-19 in Europe, where I say this has now taken over the immediate focus of the health system, because this is the one big issue at the moment, and many African countries where it is one in addition to many other health problems that also need to be tackled at the same time. Leslie.
So for South Africa's health system, this is a huge strain, and for South African health workers, it's an incredible burden, and the big issue of mental health, of burnout of health workers is very much to the fore. They are working under very difficult circumstances. Their colleagues, their peers are getting ill. They might have gotten ill and survived. They're working with uncertainty. the epidemic changes, from 1 month to the next. We had an epidemic roll out differently in different parts of the country. I'll give you one example of kind of a disjuncture between the public perception and the experience of health workers. So South Africa has a very high rate of alcohol-related harm. So we have high rates of injury from alcohol, and people working in primary care know this because they see consequences of injury, violence as a result of exposure to alcohol. So South Africa has been one of few countries to actually ban alcohol sales completely. It was done in the first lockdown and had this miraculous effect of emptying our trauma units by about 60%. The second time it was done again, and it had the same effect. And now it's been done the third time during the second wave. And, people are absolutely gobsmacked that, Baragwanath Hospital, the biggest hospital in Africa, had no trauma cases on New Year's Eve as a result of the ban. And health workers really feel that. They feel that so deeply that, lifting that stress on them. But in the public, certainly in the corporate world, there's completely different views, complaining that people's livelihoods are being threatened because alcohol is banned. So here we have a health workforce that is extremely stressed, extremely busy, trying to deal with everything. And this particular measure really helped. But in the wider context, it's seen as interfering with people's rights or the economy. So that's a tension we have to live with. And South Africa has a high, before COVID, it had this quadruple burden of disease, which is well known in the Lancet. Well, we still have that quadruple burden of disease that we have to deal with.
Andreas, yeah.
Yeah, can I add something? Because I think what sprang to my mind, many experiences from our partners in African countries and also other countries point out that it is not only the virus that is endangering lives, but also the repressive policies that have been implemented by governments in justification to keep the virus at bay. So this is particularly problematic. When we discuss this in Germany, of course, too, what means a restriction of personal freedoms. In some African countries, like school lockdowns, has been much longer and much more prolonged than in European countries, which of course creates the same problems in Germany and additional problems in societies where, for example, school meals are an important component of the day-to-day livelihood of poor people, of children from poor families. So then also the governments have used these lockdown policies also to infringe on civil society protests against their policies. I think this is also a dangerous dynamic that we can see not only in African countries and in many countries that we don't have seen in that, and we have this debate in Germany to a certain extent, but not in the way that we hear this from our African colleagues.
Good point. As we are running to the end of our talk, I would like to ask one final question to both of you. As we are still at the beginning of the year, I think it is a good question to ask whether about your expectations of this year. What do you think? What needs going to happen very currently, and secondly, what are your personal expectations about the pandemic in 2021? Do we find the solution this year, or does it take longer? Question mark.
Leslie.
You start. I'll do the easy question. Look, I don't think we are going to be free of this epidemic this year. That's absolutely clear. How well we will be free will depend on many things. It will depend on how our institutions respond. It'll depend whether our governments actually balance the science with the rights issues, because we have seen governments using the science to abuse. I mean, when Andreas was talking about the repression, I mean, the Ugandan election comes to mind. The idea that an opposition leader could be in jail because he violated a COVID restriction really is likely to undermine any trust in public messaging about COVID. And it also depends on the extent to which civil society is able to successfully put pressure. I'm vaguely optimistic that the waiver will get traction. We're seeing more and more countries coming around to it. The comments of China are not exactly clear, but they certainly seem to be sympathetic. There's a new president in the United States. Well, who knows? And if civil society is able to muster the same kind of pressure as it did with HIV, I think we could see some progress on that. And that will mean that in the next year, there'll be big changes. It's hard to predict. We won't see the end of the epidemic in this year, but at least perhaps in the next year, we will have much larger numbers of people protected and new policies in place. The whole thing is we can't go back to business as usual. We have to have new systems in place that are more equitable, more egalitarian, more fair, more transparent. Thanks.
Thank you. Andreas.
Yeah, I start from there. We can't go back to business as usual. I think this is also what the experience from the German debate about health systems structures and it has shown very clearly, and the reliance on private solutions on public problems, I think, has gone down. And this is an optimistic, let's say for me, an optimistic point I could make, that I think it will become clear that we cannot continue in this kind of business model efficiency talk about how health systems are run, how many hospitals we need, how much we can cut on budgets on this. I think this is something that really has changed the situation, and so this, in that way, I'm very, very reluctant in giving prognosis. This is something you learn in medicine, that you always you have to do it because people are expecting that you do, but you so often fail that you try to get away with it. No, but what I think is that we still need much more debate on this global solidarity level. I think there's a dynamic in, like least in Germany, also in Europe, I see is at the moment when people feel they are threatened by something very serious, they tend to go back to this nationalist thing, or we have to secure the vaccines, and this is mostly seen in the vaccines issues. So even within the European Union, and I think this is something that will continue over the next month. Yes, as I say, I'm afraid I'm not so. I was more optimistic earlier that by summer comes in Europe, this might end for, like as we had seen in last summer, the dynamic. But I'm still not optimistic that we will not have a rebound of it in last fall as we did seen in 2020. That's my suggestion.
Thank you very much. I would like us to have a look at Wiebke, what she did in the meantime and what she grasped from our discussion. And maybe we could have a look at what her picture looks in the meantime. Okay, wow, something happened there. Could you please explain a little bit what was your key essentials? What did you grasp?
Sure. For me, the main piece really is this in the middle. We have to keep in mind that this is regarding the health and the lives of people all around the world. This is not, as you pointed out so nicely, this is not about producing a printer and making a profit of it, but this is concerning the entire world and therefore should be a public good, where the public invests and also the public who is putting the money where their mouth is gets the return, rather than what we're seeing right now, which is, unfortunately, it really pierced my heart, a global stampede and coming back to nationalism and protecting very local interests. So we really need to focus more on transparency, on aiming for sustainable solutions and building local capacities so that African or other countries are capable to produce themselves, but also not just with the watch on the vaccination, but also with a view towards the general health system, like simple measures for hygiene, like washing hands and so on. And overall, I think what's most important is to come from solidarity versus coming from charity or volunteerism by the corporations.
Okay, thank you very much, Wiebke.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I will also thank you all here on the panel for your really valuable thoughts and points you made. Allow me just to make an outlook or just an announcement for our final Africa talk of this, so to say, first series of 10 web video talks. We are delighted to have an outlook of this year of 2021 with the former president of Germany, with Mr. Horst Köhler, who is an expert on African and also on German or European issues, and we would like to discuss his thoughts and expectations on a, as he would say, a new vertical between the African and the European continent. And this talk will take place on February 25th. So you're all invited to attend there. But for now, thank you very much for your attendance on the live stream, on our Facebook live stream and on our YouTube live stream. That was our 9th Africa Talks. We are looking forward to discussing with you other topics this year. The next one with President Köhler in February. Many thanks to our speakers. Goodbye, take care, and at least stay healthy, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.